Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Angela Stewart. I'm a volunteer and Zoom host for this session today because we are doing a hybrid session. We are recording it and we will be able to interface between those at home and those who are here in the room. Those at home or online, if you have questions, you can use the chat function. You can also raise your hand. I will, you can directly message me or you can or just message the entire group. So I will, be watching those chats as we go. Um, I will let our presenters introduce themselves, but I have been asked to start us off by sharing a few slides with you. And we are presenting this conference on land that was inhabited by the Nunquak, Nonotuck, and Pocumtuck people prior to European colonization. As we work to heal the destruction caused by colonization, we appreciate your support, solidarity, and continued learning. And we have this website for you to check out that can give you more information to understand the land that you are on. We are also acknowledging racial equity in the food system. We recognize that our agricultural system is built on stolen land and the forced labor and exploitation of stolen Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Our conference aims to help to address this harm and bring equity to the food system. You have opportunities in your program to participate in our BIPOC and White Ally Caucus groups over the weekend. Meeting days and times are there. And this is a long list that you can look to find out how to support BIPOC-led organizations through sharing land, money, equipment, and connections. And some of these organizations are listed here. And I'll just give you a minute to digest that. And I wanted to share these slides with you. Partner level sponsors, supporter level sponsors who all make this possible. And don't forget the NOFA summer auction bid online. And without further ado, I will turn this over to our presenters.
Hello, everyone. I am working on sharing my screen. Success. Um, it's nice to see you all in person, and it's nice to see a few of you virtually. Welcome to Processing Surplus Food for Hunger Relief. I am Haley Schulman, the National Site Coordinator for Food Rescue US. And we have Ava Agudelo, who is here as the Director of Hope's Harvest in Rhode Island. I will be speaking first, and then she will speak about her organization, and then we will come together after to speak about processing. We both represent hunger relief organizations and are all too familiar with how wasted food and food insecurity remained intertwined challenges in our local, regional, national, and global food systems. Food waste is a crisis, hunger is a crisis, and alongside each other, these crises make no sense. We will discuss how farmers and gardeners play a key role in improving food access amongst the most food insecure communities in the nation. We will discuss our experience, or spoiler alert, lack thereof, experience processing surplus produce for the purposes of serving the hunger relief market. So my chance to talk about Food Rescue US. We are a national organization on the dual mission to combat both food insecurity and food waste. We do this by engaging volunteers who pick up rescued surplus foods from donor and deliver that to a partner hunger relief organization. We are currently in over 35 different locations, excuse me, which now make up 20 states and DC. And in New England area, we are in Fairfield County, Connecticut, Litchfield County, Connecticut, West Hartford, Connecticut, New London County, Connecticut, Falmouth, Massachusetts, Barnstable, Massachusetts, and Boston, Massachusetts. So let's talk about food waste. excuse me. In the US, 40% of all food is wasted across the food system. And on farms, that number drops to 21%. Surplus food in landfills decomposes and produces carbon dioxide and methane gas, both incredibly harmful greenhouse gases. Food waste is responsible for 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And just looking at some of these numbers, 80.6 million pounds of surplus food was generated in 2019, 225 plus million tons of CO2 sequestered release or CO2 released, excuse me. And that equates to about 24 million Olympic pools worth of water waste. And now let's talk about the hunger crises. So in 2021, the number of food insecure individuals remained 19% higher than pre-pandemic levels. That equated to 42 million people, including 13 million children, estimated to be food insecure. 1 in 6 children are currently living in hunger in the US. Hunger and malnutrition exacerbate and lead to chronic physical and mental illnesses, including diabetes, obesity, and more. This impacts productivity in both the school and the workplace and the wellness at home. In the US, $52.9 billion were spent in additional healthcare costs, spent on food insecure households. And 23.5 million people currently live in food deserts. And just to define some of these key points, food insecure, somebody is defined as food insecure, which, excuse me, I should rephrase that. Somebody is experiencing food insecurity, you're not defined as food insecure. When you do not have a reliable source for your next meal. And food deserts applies to locations without a grocery store in an X radius, which actually I don't know what that number is. Ava, you might know it better than me, or somebody in the audience might know that number. Oh. Okay, so how does Food Rescue US combat these two challenges? Our model is a direct transfer model. So our food donors, our business food donors who contact us when they have surplus foods. And so sometimes that's grocery stores, sometimes that's farms and farmers markets, and we'll speak about farms and farmers markets shortly. Our food rescuers are individual volunteers who go in their own vehicles to pick up that surplus food from that business donor and deliver it to a social service agency. And so Food Rescue US is quite unique because we have a web-based app that allows for these transactions to happen. So site directors work on scheduling rescues. Volunteers see these rescues to claim on their own time. They have all the information that they would need, so they do not have to bother the site director or you as the gardener or farmer. And it's simply all electronic and at their fingertips. We are volunteer driven, so we find that highly sustainable and allowing to build community amongst these 3 players. And again, our direct transfer model allows us to really focus on highly nutritional, fresh produce. We take out a middleman of a warehouse that collects items, categorizes them, and then distributes them. That is that direct transfer. And so our impact. Since our founding in 2011, we have provided over 85 million meals to people in need, which means that we have diverted 109 million pounds of food from landfill and avoided over 150,000 tons of carbon dioxide. Okay. And so how do we partner with farms and gardeners, excuse me. So we do farm rescues. You can consider this something like if a farm has a CSA and those CSA shares aren't picked up, those CSA shares can be donated. We also partner with farms when there simply is just an enormous surplus at an individual time. And one of our farm partners gave us a quote, not for this, but shockingly came in an email yesterday, very appropriately timed. So quote, we appreciate the service Food Rescue US provides because leftover produce usually happens during our busy season when we don't have time to deal with it. We feel good knowing that we can call Food Rescue US and they will pick it up and disperse where needed. So really Food Rescue US site directors act as a connector between all of these food donors and all of these agencies, allowing for that to be something taken off the plate of these farmers or gardeners. We also rescue from farmers markets. At the end of the market, consider if that farm vendor doesn't have another farmers market for X amount of time, or the lettuce that they cut that morning wouldn't necessarily last until the next market. Anything unsellable for that vendor, but still perfectly good to eat, is what we would rescue and again distribute to one of our partners. We've also partnered with grower organizations and built Grow Row is an idea where home gardeners would either plant excess for the purpose of donating when that comes in, or if your home garden has an abundance of a certain item at a certain time when you're unable to enjoy it yourself, you would donate it. And so we have Grow Row collection drop-off points that we have specifically stationed at farm stands or at farmers markets for the purpose of encouraging these home gardeners to shop and become supporters of that farm or farmers market. We also supply volunteers to glean or harvest help. So instead of volunteers going in and picking absolutely everything, we have agreements with some farms where we supply volunteer pickers, and a portion of what gets picked, gets donated to the farm, while the other portion goes for that farmer to sell. Another very unique kind of gleaning opportunity that we did last year that somebody in the crowd is super familiar with. We cleaned a bunch of cabbage from a farm that had been held in their storage incorrectly, but again was still perfectly good to eat. So it didn't necessarily make sense for the farm to pay for their staff to clean those vegetables, but it absolutely could be eaten if cleaned. So we provided the volunteers to help clean all of that cabbage. And I love that story. I just think it's a very unique partnership opportunity that really came about because we have these existing relationships with farmers and existing relationships with agencies who we know could use that cabbage right away. We have a buy two, give one farmers market program at one of our markets. So we encourage shoppers to buy a little extra from their favorite vendors, and there is a collection point for those shoppers to donate those a little bit extra, and then we donate that to a receiving agency at the end of the market. And then we have also in the past partnered with the FarmLink project, which came about in the pandemic and supported farmers when they did not have the supply chain access to get their produce to their usual vendors. Ava?
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? Nod, yes. Yes. Okay, cool. So thanks, Haley. My name is Ava Agudelo. I'm the founder and director of Hope's Harvest, Rhode Island. We are now actually a program of Farm Fresh Rhode Island, which is a larger organization that was our fiscal sponsor when we started in 2018, and we've now joined up with them. So I'm going to go over in the same way that Haley did a little bit more about our organization, and some of the things in here are a little bit redundant in terms of the bigger picture around hunger and that type of thing. But we are working just within the state of Rhode Island. We do some food recovery from Massachusetts, southeastern Massachusetts, and that area. But for the most part, we're working within one state. So our mission is to improve the livelihoods of local farmers, increase food security for our most vulnerable residents, and get everyone engaged in strengthening the food system by eliminating on-farm food waste in Rhode Island. Our vision is to make sure we have strong and connected communities where farmers, first and foremost, are honored, valued, and compensated for their contributions. But neighbors also get their hands dirty and have fun helping each other, and everyone gets to enjoy an abundance of fresh, healthy food. And our strategy is we fill resource and logistics gaps in our local food system by getting volunteers to rescue surplus food, and we link farmers to hunger relief agencies across Rhode Island. So like Haley was saying, we have these relationships with agencies and with farms, and we bring them together. Next slide, please. So in Rhode Island, we have the same sort of hunger issues that you have all over the country. And I think one really important point to mention, or a couple important points about this, is that, we were at 9.1%, and then the pandemic happened, and everyone knows that hunger sort of skyrocketed during that time period. So we had 1 in 4 households during the peak of the pandemic, and it has since gone down, but it has not gone down to the levels that it was prior to the pandemic. So it's gone down, but it's still twice as bad as it was beforehand. So it was a crisis, then it got to be a really bad crisis. Now it's still a pretty bad crisis. All right. So the other thing that I think is helpful to see in this graph is who's disproportionately impacted by hunger. And you see that it is Black, Latinx households and households with children specifically, and then also seniors are disproportionately impacted by hunger. So I think that's good context, particularly in this larger discussion at the entire NOFA conference around food justice and equity. Who are we talking about, and making sure that we're explicitly clear about who's feeling those impacts. Next slide, please. What do people experiencing food insecurity eat? So one of the things I felt like was really important to make a case for is that people are going to eat food if people are eating food, right? So even during the pandemic, people who had been able to maybe shop at the grocery store, shop at the farmer's market, weren't able to anymore, were going to the food pantry to get food, right? So they were still getting food. They were just getting different food that was paid for in a different way from different sources, right? And so a lot of times the food that's going into a food pantry, which people have sort of an intuitive sense of, is grains, cereals, things that are not fresh, right? Because there's not a lot of capacity to store fresh food. But they're also heavily subsidized foods. So they're foods that are being purchased with government funds often from, and benefiting corn and soybean farmers in the Midwest. And those foods get heavily processed and then end up in a food pantry. Right? So I just making sure that people understand that there was a shift in who was able to access food in which ways during that time. Next slide, please. So this is also kind of a bigger picture thing from Refed, which is an amazing organization that does a lot of research on food waste nationally. And they talk about food waste at all different places in the supply chain. And as you can see, food waste in the home is a very serious and significant proportion, but all the way over on the left, food waste on farms. This is sort of semi-outdated data, but still showing that about 21% of all food that's wasted in the United States is wasted at the point of production and the farm level. So that's not insignificant, and it's quite a lot of money also. It's about $14 billion worth of missed income opportunity for farms in a lot of ways. Next slide, please. Why does food go to waste on farms? I think this is something everyone here probably has a pretty good sense of, but mostly it's people have made money off the crop, don't need help picking, or they don't need a second picking. They don't have time, they don't have labor, there's no market for the crop, there's oversupply because of favorable conditions, or there's something grew too quickly and now it doesn't meet the grade anymore that you need to be able to give it to a particular wholesale customer, for example. And then seconds, product quality, aesthetics, sizing again, and lots of other issues, but that's a good summary. Next slide, please. So I think people tend to not think of Rhode Island as an agricultural state, but it's very small. We don't grow a lot of food, obviously, compared to a lot of other states, but I do think that it's helpful to understand that even in a state like ours, given the percentage of food that is going to waste, it's still pretty significant. And I think that's useful. And also understanding the different research that's come out and the sort of range of understanding around how much and what the percentage of food is that's going to waste. There's a lot of different studies. The two that I think are most accurate, likely at this stage, are the Vermont Food Loss Study and the Santa Clara University study. And both of those are roughly in the 34% range. There's a huge variety in different types of crops and what goes to waste. As you might imagine, things that are higher value, for example, raspberries, you don't have very much waste. You have like 2% waste with the raspberry crop because they're so expensive, they're so valuable. But with something like the Santa Clara University study looked at romaine lettuce. And if you've ever seen folks picking romaine lettuce in the field out in California in that that sort of like high volume type of operation, and you get those teeny tiny romaine lettuces in the grocery store in a bag, and it's like, at least 50% of that lettuce disappeared before it even made it to the grocery store. So there's a big range there, but you think on average, if you break it out across all those different crops, you're looking at about 35%. Next slide, please. So what we do, again, very similar to Food Rescue US, we recruit volunteers from the community. We go out, we rescue surplus food from farmers' fields. We're really just very focused on that gleaning aspect, except for in a couple other instances, I'll explain later. And then we deliver it to people who need it most. So very straightforward model, logistically very challenging, but we like to explain it in the simple way first. Next slide. So these are our farm partners all together. This is data from, I believe, 2021, not the end of the season. Last year, we recovered about 230,000 pounds of food from farmers all together. And all together, we have a big range of farms. So we get a huge amount of food from some of our larger wholesale farms, like Four Town Farm is a multi-generational. I think they farm on like 50 acres, all the way down to something like a small CSA farm that doesn't usually have a lot to donate, but they like to give when they can. And we like to be able to accommodate all of those different types of growers. Next slide, please. We distribute to a lot of different agencies, again, a big range. We bring a lot of food to the Rhode Island Community Food Bank, and then they use their distribution infrastructure to get that food out to the hunger relief agencies, which is amazing, makes our lives a lot easier. But we will also do distributions to smaller agencies as well, because we like to be able to make sure everybody's getting access. Next slide, please. So in total, all of our numbers since 2018, when we were founded, we've recruited about 700 volunteers. About 350 of them have actually shown up and spent almost, at this point, it's over 5,000 hours rescuing about 650,000 pounds of fresh food from 48 different farms across Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. And we've distributed to 48 hunger relief agencies who collectively serve about 35,000 individuals per month. What I'm going to talk about next is we've also directed over $250,000 in payments over 3 years to 32 local farms for surplus or contracted produce for delivery to hunger relief. So we are going back to that original mission, which is we want to make sure farms are sustainable, and we want to make sure farmers are compensated for the work that they're doing. We are looking at ourselves as sort of in the case of contracting, an easy wholesale market, and in the case of surplus purchasing, a buyer of last resort. So if there's produce that can't be sold and you can't afford to donate it for one reason or another, we want to have funds available to make sure that farmers are also potentially getting paid for their product if they really need to get paid for it, because we believe that makes it a more sustainable system overall. So next slide, please. So the three different things we offer to farmers, as I've been saying, gleaning, forward contracts, and surplus purchasing. Next slide, please. In the case, liability is something that always comes up. We make sure that we have liability coverage and that we're covering all volunteers when they're coming out to the farm. So that's something people tend to get a little concerned about. We've really never had an issue, knock on all the wood. But we are covered if anything like that does come up. And there is liability coverage at the state level, oftentimes for donations and anyone who's participating in that process. It's the Good Samaritan Act, and it's considered, or there's a federal Good Samaritan Act, and then there's also state level legislation in many states. Next slide, please. What's in it for farmers? The warm, fuzzy feeling, which is more motivating than I think a lot of people realize when you deal with all of the other logistical stuff, because farmers are very focused on bottom line, which is so important and necessary. And if we can manage all of that, they get to have that experience of generosity and giving. And I think that's actually really profound and something that is really motivating for the farms that we work with. It can be a tax write-off. It can also be exposure for your farm. It's a form of sponsorship where we get the name out of the farms that are donating to us, to all of those volunteers. And they become loyal customers at the farmers market. They tend to go to farm stands and things like that. So that's a really good way to build loyalty in a customer base. And then again, stipends and contracts available and sort of long-term resilience of the food system. One thing that we've heard from farms that contractors get surplus purchases from us is that we're a much more beneficial customer to work with than some of their wholesale buyers because we're more flexible. So farmers will grow a crop for, say, Whole Foods. And then if Whole Foods can find it for a penny cheaper somewhere else, they will not accept the crop. Or if it's a little bit too big, they cannot accept the crop. And that's a season's worth of work for the farmer kind of down the drain. And they can't count on those markets and being part of this sort of global supply chain, but they can count on us because we're less picky. They know we'll take it. And they know that we're not going to kind of ditch out at the last minute on those agreements. So that's something that's very beneficial as well. Next slide, please. Market opportunities. People don't really tend to think of hunger relief as a market, but food pantries buy a lot of food. Hunger relief agencies buy a lot of food. They have donations that they get from private sources, but also they get line items in state budgets to buy food. It is a market, and it's maybe not as high end as a restaurant market or a farmer's market, but there's benefits to selling wholesale as well. So that's something to consider that people aren't always aware of. We have a pantry in South County in Rhode Island that spends $40,000 a year on produce. And a lot of time that money is going out of state. It's going to, producers in Georgia or Florida, because those are the distributors that will sell to them. And that's a shame to have that money leave the state when it could potentially stay with our local growers. Next slide, please. So when we contract with farmers, we do a facility fee for use of land, seed, and cost of cultivation and maintenance. We project a crop yield. Farmer agrees to plant and cultivate for the purpose of hunger relief. And then we supervise maintenance and harvesting activities, which helps bring the cost down for the farmer and gives us access to a lower overall wholesale price. We do have insurance coverage, and we do 60% on signing payment, and then 40% when the full crop is delivered by the end of the season, whenever that is. We're very flexible around the crop. Weight is important to us. So that's one of the things that makes us a unique buyer, is that we're thinking about it in terms of full bellies. So if someone tries to replace zucchini with cucumbers, great. If someone tries to replace zucchini with cilantro, doesn't work for us, right? Because we're trying to make sure that we're getting a lot of servings of vegetables out into the community. Next slide. So in 2021, we awarded $94,000 in contracts to the farms listed here. 30% of our contracts in 2021 went to farmers of color, including Margaret and Teo Martinez, who are incredible farmers. They fulfilled their contract within like a month and a half. They thought we were going to go all season long, and they were like, we have more food. So we also work with Movement Ground Farm above, and this year we are up to 60% of all of our contracts are going out to farmers of color. And that's a commitment that we have to address some of these historical inequities and who has access to these types of payments through our sort of national types of subsidy systems. Tends to be, multi-generational landowners, and we want to try to shift that dynamic. Next slide, please. Surplus purchasing, 80,000 pounds in 2021, $25,000 worth. That was actually a little on the low side. This year we're at 30,000 in our budget available. And we tend to, this is something that's actually pretty easy to fundraise for. So when we're asking funders, or they're asking us, what do you need? And we say, well, we do like to buy produce from farms. And they will be like, oh, that sounds great. That supports a local business. Like, yes, it does. So sometimes we end up with more funds to do this by the end of the season.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. So those are all the different things that we do. And now we can shift into talking a little bit more about the value added processing side of things. So Haley's going to take it back. Oh, do we want to wait until the end for questions, or?
I would take, if anyone has questions about what we spoke about, I feel like that works because we're about to shift to a different topic. Any questions from the crowd or any questions online?
I'm not seeing anything online. You can chat, or you can unmute yourself or raise your hand.
Sure.
Yeah, when it comes to produce that's being rescued, that's like maybe like aesthetically not that great or a little bit past due, is there any sort of things when it comes to processing that, say canning or like doing food donations.
So the question is
I heard.
the, okay. Do you have so very quickly, my answer to that, and we'll get into it, is that because we are the connector of so many dots, we have this network of people who can accept food as well as donate food. I strategically would partner a donation of imperfect produce with an organization that knows how to handle that. So that would be somebody who processes in general. And I'll speak a little bit to Food Rescue US's
If that's
relationship with processing, but
if that's the direction the questions are going, maybe we just go
just talk
into
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. So as far as Food Rescue US goes with food processing, I will say that there is we we don't really do it. And that's because we are this direct transfer and connecting that food to others who would do it. So, our model, as I had mentioned, we don't have a warehouse, we don't have a facility, we don't even have a headquarter office. So there wouldn't really be a place to process any food. Also, when you are considering processing, and Ava will go into this, there's a lot of things to consider. So we work on donation surplus, whereas Ava may have a bit more flexibility with knowing in theory what's coming. Food Rescue US does not know what's coming. So I could get a call on a Sunday that on Monday we have all of this food, and that doesn't necessarily allow for the time that it takes to put a plan into place to preserve foods. And again, that being a logistics plan in general, staff who has expertise in that, and a place to store food or even to transform it. With that said, we do have partnerships with organizations who do that as their business. So as an example, at our Food Rescue US site in Detroit, there was in the pandemic multiple experiences they had where an entire truck full of a single item had the opportunity to be donated. And while they do have pantries who can distribute that right away, there was a visible need to transform that into meals, not necessarily canned goods or bellies. And so an organization came out of that experience, Make Food Not Waste, and now that's exclusively what they do. So they work in donated foods and transforming that into meals. And then another organization that we work with in Cincinnati, Ohio, both the rescuing agent, so they use our software, they're not necessarily Food Rescue US, and the kitchen is La Soup. They do wonderful work accepting donated foods from grocery stores, but also farms, and transforming those into what had traditionally been soups, so that you could freeze it, package it, freeze it, and distribute it out to the end user or pantries who would be able to store it. I forgot what I was. And so that's what they do. So there's the opportunity to have hunger relief organizations transform, but from my experience, it has to be really built into the mission of the organization, which isn't necessarily what Food Rescue US does, but it certainly is possible and an opportunity. Ava, if you want to take it away.
Yeah. So again, I started Hope's Harvest in 2018, and basically, since then, I've been thinking about this question of how do we take the surplus and use it year round, right? Because I think that's something that people tend to say. They're like, eating local's fine. Local for food pantry is fine, but there's demand all year round. How do we meet that demand? I mentioned that we were fiscally sponsored by Farm Fresh Rhode Island. So Rhode Island's an interesting state. I'm guessing there's no Rhode Islanders in the session, but if you are, hello. Rhode Island is an interesting state because it's very small. So in other states that are larger, they may have multiple organizations doing lots of different things, right? Like Haley's saying, there's, folks who do processing, folks who do this, folks who do that. In Rhode Island, because we're so small, Farm Fresh has really taken on the role of what would be multiple organizations in a lot of different states. So we run farmers markets, and we do nutrition education, and we do this program called Harvest Kitchen. Harvest Kitchen is a physical processing kitchen that provides job training to at-risk youth, and has been in operation for a while. It has a storefront and a deli, and it is supported in part by DCYF. So we work with the Department of Children, Youth, and Families to provide this sort of job training opportunity. And a big portion of the activities that happen are processing. So they are already, and have been for many years, processing tomatoes, applesauce. They have a few recipes that they've been doing, dilly beans, dilly carrots, that kind of thing, with product that they have known has been sort of widely abundant. So what that means is that we sort of had this in-house processing infrastructure already, right? And when I got started, I was talking to Boston Area Cleaners, which is a mentor organization of ours, and they had tried to do some processing with Commonwealth Kitchen. And because of the cost of the processing, it was sort of prohibitive in terms of being able to actually effectively direct the surplus produce into that system. But they did say if we had it in-house, it might be easier to make that model work, right? So this always been kind of floating in the back of my brain. Farm Fresh recently also built a new building. So we had been operating out of the Hope Artiste Village, which was a renovated warehouse mill building, as many of us in New England are familiar with the renovated warehouse mill buildings. That was not great for all of the work that we were doing. We have a food hub, and it's called Market Mobile, and we bring in millions of dollars worth of produce and other value-added products from all over the region and distribute them out in the state, and also a little bit into Massachusetts and Connecticut. And so we needed a better facility for that with loading docks and things like that. So they built a building from scratch, which will include a commercial scale kitchen to do processing for institutional markets, for schools and universities and other potential institutional markets. So with that in mind, we brought on an intern to work with us on really mapping out what utilizing gleaned or surplus produce for hunger relief would look like. And this is the these are the results of that project, which started last fall. And we really dug into some of the numbers. So I'm going to get into some of the details about that with you all now. So next slide. So the basic concept of doing value-added surplus is a sort of social good, not-for-profit model, where you take this gleaned produce or whatever the surplus produce is, and you turn it into a value-added product. And then you can sell it either at grocery stores or farmers markets or through a food hub platform, if you happen to have one on hand, which we do, at sort of a higher price that actually then subsidizes the donation of that produce or the cheaper sale of that produce potentially to hunger relief agencies. So it's this kind of Robin Hood model. If folks have done that with like a CSA, where you have different scales of pricing for different customers, right? So that you can offer subsidized shares. It's doing that type of thing, right? And then potentially the funds that you earn go back into funding the project so that we can continue to get that produce out of the field and into the processing facility. Next slide. There are similar projects like this. So one of the things that I have been noticing, and one of the reasons I was excited about this, is because I was seeing it happen in other places. So if you go to the next slide, even as early, I think I went to a refed conference at Harvard in like 2019 and heard about this program, Abundantly Good. So this is in Pennsylvania, and they take milk. There's a lot of surplus milk and dairy farmers in Pennsylvania, and they make a cheese, and they sell that cheese at a higher price in markets. It's branded as, a cheese with a social mission. And then they're able to then take that same cheese and offer it to hunger relief agencies all over the state. And it's a good model. It's been working. And to me, it seems like a really, very thoughtful and smart way of taking advantage of this product that was not being fully utilized. Next slide. The other project that's really inspiring is happening at Good Shepherd Food Bank in Maine, which I highly encourage everyone to take a look at them. They're an incredible organization that's very innovative. And they had this twofold goal to build up a source of nutritious food and to strengthen the local food system. And it actually earns income for the agency. So they're using existing infrastructure that doesn't get used year round. So in Maine, there's this blueberry freezing equipment because it's a big blueberry producing state, and it's only in production at the height of that crop. And so they had to figure out what's a crop that's coming in at a different time that could use that same infrastructure, and they came upon broccoli. And so they actually hired someone to run this as a business. They potentially have a contract with Hannaford's to actually sell that product into Hannaford's and then also make it available to hunger relief agencies. So I think that's a really, really neat, again, model, really smart. Takes a lot of work though, and a lot of thinking about how to do it. And they're doing it on a pretty big scale. And they're actually buying that broccoli. It's not donated broccoli. It's not gleaned broccoli. They are contracting with growers to grow that broccoli so that they can make this business model work. Next slide, please. So what we did, any good, if you're thinking about a business, is to do your market research, right? So we did a survey with our agencies, agency partners, about value-added products and what the demand would actually be. What do they actually want based on what we knew we had available potentially within our state after, 4 years of gleaning and knowing what there's a lot of, basically, what there's a lot of every year, regardless of the weather, the temperature, what have you. We always have a lot of these things, right? So next slide, please. So we asked the questions, what agency do you represent, name and title, how many individuals does your agency provide food to? Because that helps us understand the scale of the demand, right? Do you have the capacity to store frozen product? Not a lot of agencies do. So we wanted to see what number and size of freezers they had, or if storage costs on our end was something that needed to be built in, right? That we would have to hold that product before it could be distributed. And we would only be able to distribute it, a few cases at a time versus being able to bring multiple cases to an agency and let them distribute it over time. Same thing with storing canned, shelf-stable product. How many cases of food monthly would they be able to take? Does the agency purchase food? Do they have any budget to spend? Not that we would be necessarily asking for the full cost, but could they help offset some of the costs potentially? Because if they're already purchasing food, as we talked before, then being able to direct that into the local farm community, local farmers would be ideal. And then asking if they're a meal site or a pantry, because that actually has an impact on what type of product they might be interested in and how the packaging is. If they could take larger packaging versus smaller packages that are designed for distribution to families, or if they're cooking for 100 people at a time. Next slide. And then we asked about the product. So no one needs to be reading this slide. It's a very tiny lettering. Sorry about that. But we asked for their desirability of each of the following products. So again, the things that we thought would be available included apples, tomatoes, carrots, kale, winter squash, butternuts, butternut squash, same thing, potato soup, or a vegetable stock. So these are the things we knew we had a lot of, very consistently would be able to access a lot of. And we asked for which products they would take in which form, right? So for some things, applesauce, jarred quart, pretty straightforward. But tomatoes, jarred or frozen, carrots, peeled, cut, frozen, or potentially noodles, vegetable noodles. No one really wanted the vegetable noodles, I'll tell you right now. The winter squash is the one that tends to be the most versatile, right? So there's a lot of different things you can do with winter squash. We just have infinity butternut squash in Rhode Island, we asked a lot of different questions about winter squash, pureed, noodles, riced and frozen. And this was also based on the equipment that we knew we would have access to in the Harvest Kitchen, commercial kitchen build out. Sorry, I'm camping with my family in Vermont right now. My kids asking for a beverage. So we wanted to make sure we would actually be able to produce these items, right? So, peeling and squashing peeling and squashing. Peeling and dicing winter squash is a very resource intensive operation, but if you're getting a big piece of equipment to do it, it becomes more accessible. We have to sort of be able to justify that cost with the demand. We asked if there were other products or modifications to the products listed above that would make it better. So if it was, in plastic quarts, jugs versus jars, that type of thing. There's another thing that comes up, which is the idea of making something that is a recipe versus providing a lightly processed thing that people can put in their own recipes. And that speaks to cultural appropriateness, which I think is a really important thing to consider. Like, we have a lot of cilantro, right? But do we want to go making, what is it called? There's like a, oh no, I can't remember. That's embarrassing. But there's this type of condiment that you can make, and it's made all over Latin America, and it's with
Chimichurri.
no, it's
Sofrito.
sofrito. That's right. And every community, every family has their own sofrito recipe. So we should not be making sofrito for anybody. That's not a good idea, right? Because you're going to take the ingredients, make your sofrito the way you want to make your sofrito. Or butternut squash soup, right? If you can make it really simple, that's one thing. And then people can sort of season it the way they want to, but you don't want to get too far down the recipe line, because making something that's really appealing to a wide range of folks is a tricky thing to do. And you want to be thoughtful of giving people the option to cook things the way they want to cook them. Next slide, please. So our survey results, we found that these were our top 4 products that people were interested in. They wanted stewed tomatoes, jarred and in a quart. And the intern who was working on this project with us is a college student, and she just did not understand. She's like, what is it about stewed tomatoes? And I was like, you put stewed tomatoes in everything. You put it in chili, you could put it in soup, you could put it in rice, you could put it, and she was like, I don't cook, I eat takeout, I eat at the meal. I was like, okay. But so stewed tomatoes, very versatile. Butternut squash soup frozen in a quart, winter squash peeled cut in 3-pound bags. And then this vegetable stock thing we put on there because we thought that that was actually something that we might be able to produce at a low cost with existing scraps from a lot of the food processing work that was happening at Harvest Kitchen anyway. So there was not a lot of demand for it, but we put it on the list anyway, just to see. We created a weighted rating to see how popular it was and the number of families of 4 that would be interested in this to get a sense of the scale of the demand. So units per month for stewed tomatoes, we could do 8,000 quarts of stewed tomatoes per month potentially and have sufficient demand for that product. So that's really granular. And honestly, it's based just on the agencies who answered the survey. So we're not trying to do a representative survey of all of the agencies in Rhode Island and understand the total statewide demand, because we didn't get sufficient response for that. So we're really just looking at the agencies that completed this to say, okay, you completed this survey, you would actually, take advantage of this product. Next slide. So then we did some enterprise budgets to see what it would actually cost to produce this and what we could reasonably charge for these products and sort of what the budget would look like. Next slide. So we had these templates from Harvest Kitchen because, like I said, they're already making these different products, and we went and filled in those templates for all of these different top 4 products that we said we would be able to produce, including labor costs, labels, jars, the cost of the product itself, Hope's harvest margin, distribution margin on Market Mobile. And we found that the pricing was very comparable to what people would be paying retail for this product. Next slide. So we got a list of these products and their suggested retail prices, our price per ounce, and then existing products and similar price per ounce, Stop and Shop and Walmart price per ounces, and found that these were more expensive, but good to have this data to really understand what we're looking at here and how, because I think people sort of tend to just default to, it's too expensive, we couldn't do it. without really running the numbers and thinking it through. And so I think this type of research, and the more granular we can get about it, it's really important for having these conversations and thinking about problem solving also. So if it is too expensive, how do we bring the cost down? Or what are the ways to solve for that? And if we are looking at subsidizing, you know, I bought a $9 jar of tomato sauce just yesterday. So people do that, and it is a thing. And you can convince people to do that if you know that either there's a experiential benefit or a values-based benefit potentially. There's lots of ways to think about that as a communications and a marketing conversation. Next slide. So some limitations. You know, we did a simple analysis. Like I said, this is not a representative survey, and not all the recipes have been tested. So the labor costs were pretty rough, but they were based on pre-existing data. And there's other limitations for this as well. Obviously, I think we could do more. Next slide. We're looking at doing a phase 2 survey with the agencies to get some more detail about their interest. And we're hoping to be able, so the Harvest Kitchen has not actually been fully built out yet for the commercial scale kitchen. And we're hoping that we would be able to put some of these products potentially into production in 2023. So that's the goal. And we, you know, we'll just see. They actually nixed the butternut squash processing equipment, which is a bummer. I mean, it's like a $30,000 machine. And then my intern found a bunch of like butternut squash lathe videos online, which is a really bad idea. Don't do that. But it's basically just lathes like on a wall and then just like running the lathe to process the squash is not safe, particularly not if you're doing like youth job training. So we're not going to do that. But so anyway, still like challenges and logistical challenges to figure out. But I think one of the big things that we think of, you know, as nonprofit staff is how do we fundraise for these types of things? And I think having this data and having this mapped out makes it more appealing, makes it something that if a funder says, hey, I'm interested in this, and we can say, cool, we've got the research, this is what we need, and this is what we could do with it, and this is the demand. So that was the sort of goal of this project. But, you know, same as Food Rescue US, we haven't actually done it. So we're not quite all the way there, but I'm happy to chat or answer any questions if folks have them.
Actually, before we go to questions, just one thing that was really interesting about your research and that I want to share with the audience is that a lot of times we have pantries who are so appreciative. So the theme of this talk was how to extend the life during the off season, but also we have a lot of pantries who are so appreciative of the butternut squash, but not everybody who frequents their pantry knows how to cut butternut squash or has the capacity or the tools needed to cut the butternut squash. And so something for that just came to mind from what you were speaking of is that it's not necessarily the length of time or the time, it doesn't extend the access through time, but also extends access even in the fresh harvest season. In theory, if we
Absolutely.
can make it
You know,
happen.
and thinking about convenience, I mean, a lot of people sort of can be a little judgy about like folks who don't cook from scratch, right? And it's like, well, I am a full-time, like I work full-time and I have an 8-year-old. I can't cook from scratch. Like, and I do this for a living and I've been doing it for 12 years, you know, and I still, it's like if somebody handed me some peeled and cut butternut squash, I would bow to them. I would be so grateful. So, and, you know, and folks who are visiting food pantries often have 2 jobs, 3 jobs that they're working just to try and make ends meet. And so that convenience, it again becomes a justice issue and people tend to not think of it that way, but it absolutely is. You're right.
Yes, we got a question.
Touch on the factor that the nutrient quality and the nutrient density of the vegetables that you'd be processing in that kitchen. I know price point relating it to like a Stop and Shop or a Walmart, you know, there's a definite difference, but there's something to be said for something that's fresh, that was grown fresh locally, and the production, you know, from field to, you know, vegetable stock or the produce, you're gonna get a higher level of nutrition from those products if you're producing.
Did
It's
you?
just like from a nutritional standpoint, I feel like that's something that's a value added beyond just the cost of food.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I did work for the Rhode Island Community Food Bank for a couple of years before I started Hope's Harvest, and they tend to shy away from messaging around nutritional quality for fruits and vegetables, canned, frozen, that type of thing, because it's people need to eat fruits and vegetables, and however they can get it, they should be getting it. And they shouldn't be saying, I'm not going to eat that because it's in a can. And frozen food, actually, the processing for frozen food these days is excellent. So they really, a lot are very, very nutritious for most frozen products because they're being flash frozen and capturing a lot of that goodness that you're talking about. I think that having the equipment to do that is a real barrier. And I know that there's like Western Mass Processing Centers, like right there, right? And they're doing a lot of that type of work with locally grown products. So yeah, I mean, I think the less time between the ground to your plate is absolutely better for sure, though.
Especially just with fundraising though. I guess that was my point, like.
Yeah.
Thing on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
So I actually have two questions. The first is specifically around the farmer contracts and the surplus purchasing. When Hope Harvest started, was that was that a part of like the foundation, or was that something that you guys decided after a couple of years that you were going to do? And how did you kind of start that process? Like, were the farmers reaching out? Was there studies to say like this is probably me? I'm just curious how that kind of started, because I feel like that's pretty unique. And then
Yeah. So I had worked with farmers for a long time. And like I said, I worked for the food bank, but I also worked for the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project for a number of years. And so what I learned working with farmers for years and years is to really value their time and make sure that they know that you value their time. And so when I first started in 2018, my first season, I applied for funding to pay farmers stipends to participate in the program. So it was a $250 signing bonus, basically, if you agreed to work with us, and then an additional $50 per hour for every hour that they had gleaners on their farm. To account for the fact that it just would take them time to be on the phone with us, to get to know the rules, and just a little bit of like let's just ease this process so you know that we value your time, and it's going to take you a little bit to get over that initial hump of like, who are you? Why do you want to be on my farm? What is this? That kind of thing. So we had that budget. And then what I realized as I was working with different types of farms at different scales was that the larger wholesale growers had thousands and thousands of pounds of surplus all the time, right? But the smaller growers who were actually more justice oriented, who really wanted to be serving the hunger relief market, were often the CSA farmers or the growers that were growing for farmers markets, who have very tight crop plans and really don't have a lot of surplus. So they'd be like, I don't know, I have like 50 pounds of cucumbers. Do you want that? And I was like, it's not, I'm not going to bring out a 12-foot box truck for 50 pounds of cucumbers, but do you have access to more land? Can you grow for us? And that's sort of how the idea of the contracts evolved. In thinking about how could we make it possible for these farms that are really committed to justice, do really want to increase food security, but it's just not part of their business model to be able to donate at the scale that would make it worth our time. And how can we still kind of include them in this process and also make their operations more sustainable, and give them another market opportunity that's a little bit simpler and easier for them than some of those more high maintenance markets like farmers markets where you're sitting at a booth all day, like that kind of thing. So really sort of thinking about developing that as a market for them. And then the surplus really happened around the pandemic. That was when that became a big thing, because there was a lot of money floating around for people who were doing basic needs. And there were a lot of farmers really struggling with, schools shutting down, they were selling to Brown Dining Services, and then all the students went away and they had, 1,000 pounds of lettuce and they didn't know what to do with it. And they were expecting to get paid for that. And so we were able to make that connection in that way and recognize that there was still quite a lot of demand for that. It also came up with the surplus around the drought that we had, not this drought, but the 2 years ago drought, where we had a lot of potato growers, a lot of wholesale potato growers. And because they weren't getting enough water, the potatoes weren't sizing up properly. Still totally edible, still totally food, but their wholesale customers wouldn't buy them. I think we spent like $40,000 on potatoes in 2020, and just were scrambling, getting money from here and there and everywhere to make sure that we could actually like pay those growers for those potatoes, so we get them straight to those agencies that were doing on the ground distribution. So it was a mix of sort of planned and evolved over time.
You had a second question?
Yeah, just a really quick question. So we're on a college campus and we're talking about food, and I'm just kind of remembering like when I was in college, specifically around food education. It was my first time like learning how to like make my own food, because I was technically like forced to. I had to like kind of figure it out. I'm curious to see like what like particularly like Hope Harvest is doing to kind of address like food education, like making your own food, trying it out, like whether that's, getting pots and pans or workshops or things like that to get people to kind of like use some of these like, vegetables to learn. Because I think when I think about resiliency, I think about how, you can just keep giving and giving and giving, but like, are you really developing an infrastructure for yourself? The first time I grew my own like cherry tomatoes, I was like, what? Like, I can do this myself when I have like access to an abundance in my backyard. Like, no one told me I could do this.
Yeah.
So just curious to see like how that kind of plays into like your mission.
Yeah. So I started working in food system sector in 2008, and worked for a lot of different types of organizations doing all kinds of different stuff, farmers markets and beginning farmer training programs and buy local campaigns and all those different things. And one of the things I learned working for smaller organizations, it's really important to draw a box around what you do and what you don't do. Otherwise you end up with mission creep and you'll burn out. And you also don't have necessarily staff to manage all those different types of initiatives. One of the things that I'm really lucky about is, again, working in Rhode Island, it's a small state. We're very well connected to all the different types of service providers. And I was on the Food Policy Council for a little while, got to know all the folks who are doing nutrition education in the state. So University of Rhode Island Extension, SNAP Ed program does a lot of nutrition ed. Again, Farm Fresh Rhode Island does nutrition education at schools, elementary, high school, middle schools, and with seniors. The Rhode Island Community Food Bank does a lot of nutrition education. They had a whole program called Food Too Good to Waste, which was awesome because it talked about making sure that you weren't throwing money away by wasting food, right? Very relevant and important for people who are, experiencing food insecurity and how to be more thoughtful about their spending and their food use habits. So we really didn't have, like, it wouldn't really actually even be appropriate for us to do that because that's being done by a lot of other amazing organizations. And the agencies themselves will often do a lot of nutrition education. So we love partnering with this one particular agency, Johnny Cake Peacedale, because there were other agencies who'd be like, no, we can't take that because the clients don't want it. Johnny Cake Peacedale was like, oh, we'll take it. And we're going to do a cooking demonstration about it. We're going to show everybody how to cook it. We're going to hand out a recipe. And we were like, yes, take the kohlrabi. Amazing. So, naturally we would work with them more because they just had more demand because they were doing a better job of that type of education that you're talking about. That is incredibly important and is really deeply part of thinking about resilience, for sure. That said, we don't do that because I want to be really clear about providing the best quality of the service that we do provide and not trying to duplicate anything that other folks are doing, which I think is just has been one thing that has helped us succeed ultimately.
I've seen also in some of our partner pantries, I love this program. At the pantry, they have recipe cards that include items that are specifically in the pantry at that time. And it kind of goes to what Ava was saying also about the cooking demos, but there's a lot of programming that goes that aligns with what you're talking about. There's certainly a need for more programming about about all of that, growing your own food, how to cook your own foods, and simple nutrition. But it's certainly in a lot of conversations that I am in. I think it's at the forefront of a lot of these organizations' minds. And I see your hand, but we do have somebody online, so I'll get you.
Let's see. This is from Will. I'm wondering to hear presenters' thoughts and possibilities around improving the supply chain around meat demand at food pantries. Any way to rescue food, any way for food rescue to be part of this discussion? Some context, I run a food pantry in Boston, serves about 200 folks in the Chinese community here. And the interest is a lot higher in meat than in other things because of the cost at getting them at a normal store. We usually get our meat from the Greater Boston Food Bank, and most of it comes from large corporate donations by Tyson, etc. Wondering if anyone has been thinking through alternatives to improve both access, environmental sustainability, and ethics of meat consumption around the demand of food pantry guests.
What a question. This doesn't necessarily apply to farm rescues, but we certainly at Food Rescue US we rescue from a whole bunch of different business partners, and a lot of those being grocery stores. And it's interesting when you see the difference from store to store, even of the same brand, but just location to location. And we really find that it's about getting an ambassador on board who's at the store. So if you have the meat ambassador on board at the Stop and Shop, you're going to be getting a lot of meat. Like we can fill up a whole, car full. We're not really dealing in trucks, but a whole car full of frozen meat. And then the issue, which you probably are familiar with, is the freezer capacity, which Ava had also mentioned previously. So it's a lot of things at play. I would be really interested. So we had a food collaborative in my community who applied for a grant specifically for funds to purchase local dairy and meat. Unfortunately, they did not get approved, but I think it's another to what we're saying. I think people are having that conversation because meat is so expensive, especially now. It's getting only more expensive. Um, so it's a good point. Ava, do you work with any animal producers?
We don't. I think we had gotten one time, like one producer, the processor used the wrong spice mix in her sausage and it was like bright red. And she was like, I can't sell this to my customers. But I think initially, we were using farm fresh infrastructure, but there's a lot of rules around distributing meat and dairy that make it really complicated. You have to check temps. You have a lot of, restrictions around when it can be moved around and things like that. Working for the food bank, we spent a lot of time talking about food safety, and the agencies themselves have to be very concerned about food safety to be a member agency of the food bank, to be able to access food bank resources. So they're only allowed to take like food from reputable sources. And so it would just open up a whole world full of logistical challenges for us. That said, now that we are part of Farm Fresh, that's opening up a little bit because Farm Fresh does do meat and dairy distribution. They do have the infrastructure for that. And one thing that I hadn't mentioned is that, so now Hope's Harvest is basically the umbrella for all hunger relief programming at Farm Fresh Rhode Island. And we just received the subcontract from the Department of Environmental Management for this new USDA grant called the Local Food Purchasing Agreement, which is an amazing program. It's really pretty revolutionary, and it is to purchase local produce and products, all types of products, including meat and dairy, for specifically hunger relief purposes. And each state received the opportunity to apply for non-competitive funds to purchase this food. So Rhode Island's allocation was $1.2 million, and we're a teeny tiny little state. I think Massachusetts allocation was like $7.5 million. to be able to do this. And so what we're doing is actually awarding grants to agencies to purchase through the Market Mobile platform. And so those agencies can use that those funds to buy anything in the platform that they want, as long as it's been produced within 400 miles, which is the restriction of the USDA's program. So with that, they can purchase dairy, meat and produce, and potentially some value-added products. We're still trying to figure that out because of the ingredient mix. But I think that's the way forward, honestly, is to have appropriate, I don't know how you all feel about the word subsidy. I know it's gotten a bad rap, but I think that the only real way to effectively make all these different types of products available and accessible is to bring in all different kinds of subsidies to the types of producers that we really want to be supporting, right? And so whether that be through USDA or through private philanthropy or through volunteer labor, all of these are different inputs into the system that we can use to make these products that are unaffordable more affordable. And the reason why they're unaffordable is because they're not getting the giant government subsidies that the cheap meat producers are getting, right? Or the environmental subsidies with all of their waste that they don't have to deal with the consequences of, right? So we have to think about how to even that playing field. And I think that, you know, public spending is a great way to do that. And I also think that there's other ways to do that. But the trick is to bring the price down for the consumer, but not for the producer. And to do that, you have to have some kind of an input that shows that you value this type of food production as a public good and as public infrastructure that supports people, whether they have the money to pay for food or not.
Your question?
Yes, ma'am. In reference to growing, I'm an organic gardener, but I'm, leaning towards the way towards farming. We have a certain amount of waste. Now we can and we give away as much as we can, but it's still every single year it yields more. Should we cut back our yield, or should we continue to move forward and find other people to pick up that extra waste? What I mean by pick up is give away to this place, give away to that place. What would you recommend?
I would certainly recommend identifying people. I think it's all about what is sustainable for you. If it is sustainable to have a portion that ends up being donated, that's an ideal scenario. But I would encourage you to find somebody like Ava or I who is a connector of dots so that you don't necessarily have to be that connector. So you don't have to be the person who takes the time to identify all of these different agencies who can pick up, when they can pick up, how they're going to pick up. There are organizations in theory that do that. And so my recommendation would be to identify an organization who would be the connector for you.
Thank you.
Couple more online. Two that are kind of related. One is, are there roles for volunteers that don't involve working in the sun, such as transport, data processing, volunteer coordination, maybe sitting at a farmer's market? I'm in Massachusetts. How can I be involved with your organization?
Whoever wants to answer first.
So we do have a couple different opportunities for volunteers that don't involve being out in the sun. That said, this year we bought a shade tent, we bought a cooler with a bunch of ice packs and ways to keep water cold. We're really thinking about accessibility and trying to think about how to, it's not getting any cooler. So if we want to be able to keep doing what we're doing, we need to be able to manage that. And we move our trips earlier during the day. So we start a lot of our trips at 8 a.m. Or even potentially earlier if we can, depending on the farm and the volunteers, to manage the heat. So that's important. But then we also have what we call volunteer trip leaders, which I think is actually much closer to the Food Rescue US model, which is volunteers who work with us for a long time that we link up with a farm and an agency, and they just do like a regular pickup. So they'll go like every Thursday and get whatever's left over from the CSA and then bring it to a particular agency. And that's just loading stuff into their vehicle and then dropping it off. So it's a little bit less intense than, picking cucumbers in the hot sun for 3 hours. We also have outreach ambassadors who will do like farmers market tabling for us and just like sort of talk to the community about what we do. And I have had, accounting help from volunteers. We've had, I have a volunteer that's doing an amazing job helping me write grants right now, which is awesome. It's really, if you are thinking about working with volunteers, it's really about listening to them, forming a relationship with them, and figuring out what they want to do. And remembering that we are a community, we're building relationships, and we're giving people an opportunity to contribute, which is actually a real blessing, because in this world can feel a little overwhelming. And so making space and giving that structure for people to share whatever talents they have is really what we're doing here. So anyways, we can make that happen. We love to do that.
I would say in a similar vein, essentially any nonprofit would consider their volunteers the backbone of their organization. You rely so heavily on these volunteers that with Food Rescue US, from Food Rescue US perspective, yes, most of the volunteer work is picking up a rescue and delivering it in your own vehicle, but also being a site director, which is being a leader in your community. So if your community does not have a food recovery program or a Food Rescue US site, volunteers are the ones who bring that site to their own communities. And that's, if anyone is interested in starting a Food Rescue US site in your community, you are strongly encouraged to speak to me. And within a site, there are certainly opportunities for marketing volunteers. If anybody wants to run my social media, you are more than welcome to do so. And some ambassador roles as well. And simply considering how Food Rescue US or how Food Recovery or how Hope's Harvest can be involved in other conversations you're having. So I'm a strong believer that your network is your net worth. So if you are considering Food Rescue US in a conversation you're having with a food policy organization, then that comes back to us. Like, that is a total win of a volunteerism in my bucket. So we would take all the help we can get in any capacity.
Doesn't matter if the food is organic or non-organic, if you're picking it up in the car, do I have to separate it? Okay, in the front seat, they're all organic, but in the back seat, they're non-organic. Does it matter?
For Food Rescue US, that does not matter. So, was there any other questions on that?
There was just some conversation from Ellen about anyone in Eastern Mass would love your food donations if you want that information. I had put it up on the screen for a few minutes. I
think maybe that was in reference to your question about excess foods. I don't know where are you located?
I'm in Springfield, Massachusetts, close to the Connecticut border.
Mm-hmm.
Ellen, I would just say we don't bring food outside of Rhode Island typically. We're usually just donating within the state. So we will harvest in southeastern Massachusetts, but we don't do outside of that.
I actually had a question too, if that's okay. That was I just got excited when somebody said, oh, they want to give away food. And typically what I find, I just have to mention this, is that with a lot of the work that we do, I just want people to think about this. We work with colonial settler structures of let's keep the food in a state, or let's keep the food in a town, or do you know what I mean? And I'm just always encouraging us to think outside of those colonial settler land confinements.
I'm thinking in terms of gas mileage and staff time.
Oh, no, I get that, but I'm just saying, like, in general, that's how all of the agencies work. Like, and this was before, gas went so expensive, but, I'm thinking of town structures, like, oh, we can do this town, but not the next one. And I'm like, why? If it's a mile down the road. But, so they wanted to sort of wonder out loud with, we founded during COVID, so we've always been under these crisis conditions. And we quite frankly founded because our local food pantry was treating us with no dignity, giving us no food, and they were getting a lot of money in donations. That said, we created our own program created by people who are experiencing food insecurity for not just impoverishment reasons, but for health reasons too, for access reasons, for disability reasons, you know, getting access to food, going in the store. So we are branching out into our next phase, and I'm wondering, how is there such a thing as a mini commercial kitchen? We are revamping my garage to be a space where we can have cooking demos, where we can have a little growing space, more food distro, more like a little mini food hub. And so I'm wondering, you know, in Massachusetts is very uptight more than a lot of places. I don't want a full-on commercial kitchen. I mean, that's just such an incredible expense also, but a little mini, okay, yeah, technically we have our 3 sinks, you know, technically we have whatever, you know, is there some kind of designation like that so we can be kind of like an in-between space in terms of the commercial kitchen?
I have to say, I don't know the answer to that question. I imagine that it would be very specific to state rules. Ava, do you have any experience from your Rhode Island survey?
I would say the same. Yeah, we weren't really focused on that with our conversation because we do have that commercial kitchen built into the farm fresh infrastructure, but that's not my program. So I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about it. I know that we have had from some of my food policy work, been back and forth about cottage food laws. And that's maybe somewhere that you want to dig into what that looks like in Massachusetts. And yeah, I assume Commonwealth Kitchen would probably have some resources for folks about that too. Do you know them?
No, and see, some of us are not able to go into shared spaces as much with COVID. So like we would do these demos like outside, and once you call it a demo, and if you're not giving out the food, but just showing, that's really different than actually sharing the food. I mean, our health department is very uptight and they won't allow any samples at our farmers market. But they can have all the pesticided food brought in from wherever.
You got a chuckle in the audience from that.
Yeah, I've been chuckling about it for quite a while.
There's another question online.
From Michelle, how can we do food rescue and get paid? I would love to volunteer, but I also have to pay bills. Now that I think of it, do you have any suggestions, tax reimbursements, question mark, etc.?
There are tax write-offs available for your gas mileage when you were a Food Rescue US volunteer. There are food recovery organizations who hire staff to do that work. You would just have to identify those within your own community. I believe you may have a hard, I will be honest with you, you may have a hard time because there are these models that are volunteer based, but they certainly exist. There may be pantries that would hire staff if they're a large pantry, maybe a large like bank operation food hub, maybe they have funding to have staff drivers. So I think it depends on your location and your local food recovery organization, but certainly you can look into the gas write-offs. Anything else? Any other questions from the audience? Oh, yay, we got one more.
Mostly just like a comment.
Okay.
I feel like I'm starting to see commercial kitchen interest, for especially for folks who are trying to do like those like value added kind of products. Like, oh, I have a whole bunch of Napa cabbage, I want to make kimchi, I need a space, or I'm making muffins or something with the zucchini, and it's I'm noticing there's a lot more of trying to find a place that is already doing it and not not trying to reinvent that wheel and sharing those spaces. And also just trying to figure out like community kitchens, right? Where people can go, because I think there's a lot of stigma behind going to food pantries or, feeling comfortable going to those spaces. So creating environments where someone can go into that space and, feel comfortable and have conversation. Um, yeah, just trying to challenge that traditional model because, food prices are going up, people are hungry. Like, how can we, create, more empowering environments where people feel like there's nothing to be ashamed about. There's food everywhere. Like, if there's anything I've learned in farming so far, there's tons of food. And coming together in spaces where you feel comfortable, I think is really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's a logistics issue, right? And I think, and I've, a lot of our partners have these are starting to bring experiences to their pantry. So it's no long, and actually the pandemic was an interesting kind of wrench in that plan because where there had been pantries where people would go inside, it was a very familiar shopping experience. Shopping, not that anything was necessarily paid for, but just experience of where you were picking out your own items. A lot of pantries or food distributions turned into this drive-through format. And so there's a lot of conversations now going back to how do we bring that humanity and that the word is escaping me, but that comfortability in accessing food. There's no shame in accessing food. There should be no shame in accessing it. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you all. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you, Ava. Good job.